Hi, and welcome to the Influential Leader podcast, where we speak to amazing individuals and leaders in their own right, in their organisations and their industry. Today, we have with us Michael Masterton, and he is a brilliant man that helps businesses turn around and understand that their intangible assets are the major asset within their business and the value of their business. Today's conversation I'm really excited about because we have a lot to learn about leadership being an intangible asset and how you can make sure that you're growing your business through leadership and other intangible assets that we talk about. So I hope you enjoy this podcast because it was a lot of fun to create. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining me today.
One of the things that I have a hypothesis on, and at some point I will go back and finish off my my graduate diploma in org psych, but I think there's a really strong correlation, and one of the universities I work pretty closely with is Sydney University's management school, Massimo Garbulo there. And I keep saying to Massimo, at some point I want to go and prove a theory. And I think my theory is pretty solid, which is there's a really strong correlation between people who come from, either a working class background or a poor background, or just where they've maybe had to fight for what they've got. In entrepreneurship and innovation, it's that how do I draw? There's no quick fix. I don't have just this endless bank account, and I think
all of them have to bootstrap, right?
Yeah, which is a very kind way of saying eat 2-minute noodles.
Yes.
So or save up for something, and I think because I grew up from very much a working class, almost poor background, and stories mum and dad telling about, literally having to reach down the back of the couch to find money for milk, and that, you've got to fight for everything you've got. And I think the only thing, I've ever been good at is putting my hand up for every opportunity that was ever put in front of me. I was always the kid. I still remember, grade 6 at Eastmoor Primary School in Melbourne.
I was going to ask where you're from. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Melbourne boy. And, back then East Bentley was very much working class. It used to be Market Gardens. And, my grandfather was an immigrant. He escaped the Nazis. And, your ancestry, I think, has a lot of who you are. And, here I am, Eastmoor, actually it must have been grade 5. And teacher walked in and said, any volunteers? I probably, probably need some strong boys. I just put my hand up, and that was to be a computer monitor back in the days where literally, I'm not joking, computers were so valuable.
I remember.
You would literally take them out in the morning and then you would put them back at night. And people are like, what? Like, are you crazy? And it's like, no, you used to actually, and then you'd have to put them all together and, put them together as a network. And that was kind of, in many ways, that was what taught me always put your hand up.
Yeah.
And I think I've always done that, and it's just led to being, I'll be honest, in the right place at the right time.
Oh, absolutely. You create your luck, right?
And the harder you work, the luckier you get.
Yeah. I absolutely believe in that. And I've always, bootstrapped, worked hard, all of that. But I think there is a validity in network. And, I've worked with a few businesses back when I started working with small business that, yes, they start from scratch, but then I've also worked with the business owner where they would have a business idea and they would go out and get money. They wouldn't fund it themselves. They wouldn't bootstrap. They wouldn't work their hardest. They would work hard to get the team together, and then that team would work. So I think, there's another way of doing it as well.
Yeah, and I've kind of done both. And I think it all comes back to the scale. I mean, bootstrapping is great to kind of get that embryonic idea up, get your minimum viable product, whatever it is. But if you want to achieve scale, it's not just about having a great idea, but you definitely need access to capital. Because, most businesses don't just get an abundance of revenue. You look at, any of the large businesses, they all needed significant capital, whether it's Tesla or Facebook or whoever. But I think the bit...
And even grants. They've even got them through grants. So, I think a lot of people have this conception that they can only be successful if they do it all on their own, when really those people that are successful at some point haven't done it on their own, right?
Yeah, and I think, that human capital is critical. I've been so lucky to always be the dumbest person in my team and in the room. I just had this great ability of being able to attract really smart people around me. Like Stephen Harrison, who we both know,
Yeah.
And it's about everyone working out what they're good at and what they're not good at. And if you're not good at it, get those people around you.
True.
But then that next element, which you heard me sort of talk about at CapTech, was that's all great, but that's predicated that the actual real assets are protectable, defendable, scalable. And that's really that expertise that we've started to talk about around intangibles, that it's not just around the people, the capital, etc., the idea, but can that idea actually stand up to other people trying to replicate that idea? Because what that ultimately does is push that margin down. And the moment you're in a race to the bottom on margin, then typically, that's not viable.
And I guess that's where your intangibles come in, because you've got other aspects of your business, which could be the people. You've got, I was just saying to you earlier, I went to one of your presentations, you've got 12 core intangible assets that you talk about. And I just think, people are definitely one of them, but you don't own people. So how do you hang on to them? How do you make sure that this asset is nurtured and stays with you, or you nurture them and then maybe they do leave, but they sometimes come back to you, or it comes back to you in other ways, I feel.
Yeah, and it's a question I often have been asked when I've given presentations as well, aren't people your most valuable asset and aren't they intangible? And I go, hang on, I just need to check that. I'm pretty tangible. And, to be completely politically incorrect, as I've said at certain appropriate conferences or groups, is, try having intangible sex tonight. Really prove the point. But the thing is that people, whilst we're tangible, we and a couple of animal species like, monkeys, etc., create intangible assets. In other words, we take something that's non-obvious. And again, with the right audience, I often joke that I still think it was probably a woman who created the first intangible asset when she picked up, an animal bone and probably belted her husband over the head with it. In other words, it's a non-obvious way to use that bone.
Yes.
That becomes very obvious, because then the husband does what he's meant to.
You got the message.
Exactly. And that's really what, that was really sort of the genesis of intangible assets, is using those inanimate objects in a way. And obviously that got accelerated through things like the Industrial Revolution, because you're able to get economies of scale. But it wasn't, the machinery enabled that, but it was how you built the machinery. It was the idea behind the machinery. And that's what's really driven human evolution, is these things called intangible assets, which is obviously, as you've heard me talk about, it goes beyond the registered rights, which is patents, trademarks, into those non-registered rights, systems, processes, knowledge, know-how.
Even innovation. Like as you're talking, I'm thinking about, I'm on a board for Super Tea, which is a charity. And one of our intangible assets, which we don't actually, register, but we do have it as our strategic plan, is innovation. Like we're always trying to think of how can we help differently? How can we be in front of people? How can, our families that support us and use our charity, feel like we're always there for them. And we're thinking of new ways of doing that all the time.
Yeah, and I think, look, I'm on Cure Brain Cancer and a couple of other charities as well. And, they are completely intangible asset organizations. When you think about it, they don't typically own their building, they don't have stock. It's their brand, it's their network, it's their community, it's their insights, it's their ability to influence that makes those organizations completely intangible. And unfortunately, a lot of those organizations inadvertently are giving away those assets for unrecognized value. And if you think about it, it's often, that they will enable, let's say, a car company or another.
So that brand alignment is an intangible asset that you're selling, I guess, if you, are smart about it.
Well, because it's that endorsement and that value of that charity's brand on a commercial brand is really valuable.
Yeah.
And nearly always I see those completely undervalued, which means the commercial partner is getting a really good deal. But in fairness, often the commercial partner doesn't really understand the value of that partnership. And one of the ones, for example, with Cure Brain Cancer, is we have this amazing community, this huge community that we can, put behind brands and stuff. So we've put a lot of focus as both the management team and the board in helping our partners understand where that value comes from.
Yeah, great. It's good that you're helping in that way too. So what about small startup businesses? I see many presentations of people asking for capital or asking for some sort of funding, and they really don't get this part. So what I want to know is who has got it right? Who out there can you share with us that you've seen, maybe someone you've worked with or someone, maybe a big player that we all know that really gets this right, that we can kind of go, let's reverse engineer that for us.
Well, the first thing, just coming back to the first question, and I got taught this valuable lesson by, someone that a lot of people probably hopefully know, is a guy called Ralph Norris, who, Ralph took Commonwealth Bank from worst performing bank to best performing bank. He literally saved Air New Zealand. And I remember, one of the first raises, Ralph gave the very, very, very valuable advice, which I'll share with everyone, which is if you want money, ask for advice. And if you want advice, ask for money.
I love that. That is so true.
So, full attribution to Ralph for that one. And I would say that, if you're going out to raise money, in fact, if you're even going out to test an idea, it's not just about raising money, but it's also about how you get customers. If you've got an early stage idea, which is say to people that you think could be customers, hey, if I go and build this product or service, is this something you would buy? Yeah, I will. Noted. And then when you've got it, you go back and say, hey, look, you said to me you would buy that. Do you want to now buy my product?
Yes.
And I do the same thing from a capital point of view is, start raising capital, start the discussion around capital very, very early on. In fact, try and take these people on a journey, but make sure you deliver on what you say you're going to do. If you say you're going to have an MVP up and running in 3 months, do it in 2. If you think it's going to take 3, tell them it's 4. Because it will always take longer than you think, and unfortunately, it will cost you more than you think.
Yeah.
So try and raise a little bit more capital than you think your immediate needs are, but start those conversations early. And one of the things that I've been talking to companies about, and this probably only dawned on me around CapTech, is don't just bring on money, but bring on their intangible assets. So even reverse the pitch. So when you're kind of pitching to someone and say, hey, I've got this great product or service, don't just ask them, look, what are you prepared? First of all, are you interested in investing? But more importantly, what other things do they bring other than money?
Yeah. So we often call that smart money. So people that are able to add value or add network or add clients or anything to the whatever, depending what you're delivering, but something that they can bring other than just money.
And so what you're referring to, Sarah, is they're bringing those intangible assets. They're bringing their networks, their relationships, them as an investor, as a brand endorsement of you. And the example I use here is imagine you brought on, maybe not Elon, but let's just say Warren Buffett.
Yes.
Because Elon can be a bit divisive. But let's say you brought Warren Buffett on as an investor.
You'd definitely be in the news if you brought on Elon.
Well, you would, I think, but you'd be more in the news in a positive way with someone like, say, Warren Buffett.
True. Very true.
Because,
and I guess that's the thing you got to think about. Is this a positive intangible asset or a negative one?
Yeah, is it aligned to what you're doing? Because now, in fairness, they probably wouldn't invest in something that was misaligned. But that value of their brand far in excess.
Oh my gosh! I think anything that Warren Buffett put his name to, you wouldn't have to ask for money. People would definitely be giving it to you.
And I think this is the thing: is that now obviously that's an extreme example, but it's just to prove the point. And there's some amazing investors out there that have these incredible brands. But they have access to networks. They can get you to deals. But again, you want to find alignment. So, for example, I had an early stage business that came up with a really interesting product. But the only way they were really going to get that is they needed access to one of the 2 main supermarket chains.
Yep.
And I said, unless you've got someone who you can get to that can get to the CEO of one of those organizations, this is really non-viable.
Yeah.
And so that element then helps you then go and find not just so much money, but you need to go and find who's the right strategic investor, partner, advisor, whatever you want to do. And this is where, even inviting someone to come on as your advisory board at an early stage, they get to know you, they get to see what your values are, and they start to think, I'm actually happy to help Bob or Mary, not just in terms of my time, but I'd actually put some money into this. And that's where it goes back to Ralph's advice, which is if you want money, ask for advice. Because quite often people will be giving you their advice and kind of going, hey, look, I think I could make $1 out of this. Do you want my money?
I remember,
I remember, again, a capital raise I was doing, and sitting. I won't name who this shareholder is because they'll probably be watching this, but a shareholder that we really, really wanted, and he happened to bring a colleague into the room, and this particular shareholder, we were asking their advice, and he went, "Hey, look, I want to put some money into this." And then, funnily enough, true story, the guy that he also brought into the meeting said, "Well, if you're going to take his money, what's wrong with mine? I want to put the same amount in." And it was just so funny because we actually never really thought about them as an investor.
Yeah.
And it was that classic example. We wanted their advice, and guess what? They wanted to put in money.
I've experienced that too. That's awesome. And I've never really kind of put a name or a thought towards it. So it's about being that more strategic around it, right?
And this is where I know I keep coming back to intangibles, but once you sort of you break those intangible assets down into those 12 categories that we have, you start to see these as assets. And one of the things that sort of dawned on me late last year is that, as you're starting to scale your business, your board actually becomes one of your most valuable intangible assets.
True.
And when you think about it from a director's point of view, apologies to any of the startups out here because the directors will now put their fees up, but most directors might charge, I don't know, in a really small company, say $30,000. As you scale 50, maybe if you're at a bank, then obviously you're in the hundreds. But when you think about what you get for that $50,000, I'll just use a small to medium-sized company. You're getting access to that person's entire corporate career, their knowledge base, their know-how. And it's not just what they know how to do, but they also can tell you all the reasons why not to do things.
True.
That is really valuable. It's what we call negative know-how. It's knowing, and it's not a true story, but the anecdote around Edison, that he had 20,000 variations of the light bulb before he found the one that worked.
Yeah.
It's often the 20,000 that enable you to get to the one. So that's where the value is.
And I guess it's the other way too. So it's about, I've met business owners that have gone through the wrong accountant, the wrong bookkeeper, the wrong this, the wrong that. And just knowing someone that can even just introduce you to someone that is good at what they do. They say they deliver. That's worth, how much does the mistake cost versus getting it right?
Because it's not just the cost, it's the time.
Yes.
And then it's the frustration. Someone I was talking to yesterday got some really bad immigration advice, and I luckily know a really good immigration person. It wasn't just that money that they spent, it's that time, and then that angst of, have I made the wrong decision? So,
true.
Surrounding yourself with people that are way smarter than you, going back to my experience, that's how we were able to scale that. My first company, by literal luck, 6 of us grew that to just around 8,000 people. But the way we're able to do that is because somehow we all just knew what we were doing, and we were all really good at what we did. And we formed this amazing team. And then we were able to create this incredible culture, just mind-blowingly, amazingly cool place to work. That was all pre-Google and all the rest of it. Google didn't even exist when we started.
Maybe they reverse engineered you guys.
They probably did. Well, I was lucky enough to meet this amazing guy called Tony Say, who unfortunately is no longer with us. But Tony he's one of the few people I've ever met that's made money 3 times.
Right.
So lots of people, well, not lots, but, to make money once is luck, right place, right time. Don't get me wrong, you got to execute. To do it a second time, again, a lot of the people I've met that have made money twice, quite often it was within their own industry, very rarely outside of their own industry. But people who make money 3 times, they are so rare. There's Elon, there's Tony Say. Yeah. And I remember Tony saying to me, when I was talking about that first startup that we did, he's like, "Oh my God, that was the first holacracy." And I'm like, "What's a holacracy?"
Yeah, good.
And he's like, "Well, where there's no kind of boss, everyone was kind of equal." And we were, it was this kind of collective. We kind of had external responsibilities, but internally everyone was kind of equal. And what he and I worked out over quite a few beers is that you can do that in a greenfield environment, but it's very difficult to do that in a brownfield environment. In other words, where there's an existing culture that you've essentially got to disrupt.
True. Yeah.
So getting this stuff right, and this really sort of comes back to leadership. A lot of my study, obviously, in my degree was around leadership. And you can study leadership, but it doesn't make you a great leader. And unfortunately, I see a lot of people that try to be leaders, but really they're managers. And unfortunately, when they often get put in a corner, they become micromanagers.
True.
And they typically manage an organization down, not an organization up and out. And, great leaders, the best leaders I see are normally not, and I'll use a slightly controversial one here just to prove a point.
Yeah.
Hitler was a great leader. Okay.
True.
He was a great leader.
Got followed.
He was absolutely, he created followers. He unfortunately was consistent. He was the most horrific human on the planet. Yeah. And again, my grandfather escaped the Nazis and I lost my grandparents in the Holocaust, or my great-grandparents. But I can't deny that he was an amazing, he got a country together, he invaded, he created a very successful army, but he failed as a leader. He ultimately failed because he was not a nice person.
Yeah.
And so quite often you see organizations achieve scale. And, if you've seen Super Pumped about Travis Kalanick, about episode 7, I met Travis and he was not a nice person.
Oh.
And, I, to be honest, didn't really know who he was. And it was at the same time I got to meet Tony Say. And Tony, super nice guy who literally just said to me, "Oh yeah, I run a shoe company." I'm like, what? A shoe business? And I had no idea what Zappo's was and how successful it was. But Tony was so humble. He lived in an Airstream in East Vegas.
Yeah. And I have to say the most successful people I've seen are very humble. I've very rarely met unhumble people that are extremely successful. Like they look successful sometimes, but when you start looking and digging, you're like, oh, right, no, you're not.
And a bit like, Adolf, not many people survive that stretch. And I was very lucky. Again, I'm not trying, I was very lucky, just, classic dumb luck that I often have. I got to fly with Branson and got chatting with him, super nice guy. And we landed in Auckland. I'll never forget this. So as we go up to the barricade, he says, "Oh, excuse me, just for a moment, Michael, I've just got to make a quick call." And I could overhear him, and he was talking to his mum.
Oh.
And I said, "Oh, Richard, did that happen to be your mum?" And he said, "Yes, every time I fly, I ring her before and I ring her when I land. Doesn't matter what time of night it is." He said, "There are moments, because she's at an age where I do wonder whether she's going to answer. But she just likes to make sure that I got here safely." And I'm like, wow, what? And he truly is such a nice guy. He is very generous with his networks. And I think this is the thing. People that are truly good people often make very, very good leaders because they're instinctual. They think about, they're highly empathetic with those they're trying to lead. Yeah. They lead from the front.
They have higher emotional intelligence.
Yeah, and I think one of my favorite sayings is don't measure people on what they say, measure them on what they do.
True. Yeah.
And and there's lots of anecdotes around here, well done's better than well said. And
success leaves clues.
Yeah. And one of my favorite movies that I love getting my leadership teams to watch is We Were Soldiers, because I've been lucky enough, one of my clients is the SAS, Special Air Services and Defense. And in the commercial world, no one dies normally, unless you're in a high risk environment. But, sure. You make a bad decision, someone might lose their job, you might lose your company if it's that bad. But when you're actually on the physical battlefield, it's not about money, it's about seconds on the battlefield and knowing how to duck the bullets. And one of the best movies I've ever seen is, We Were Soldiers, and it's about, I think it's Hal Jacobson, I think it is. I've got his name wrong, but anyway, Hal. And he had this great saying. He was one of the first battles in Vietnam, and this battle turned into just a cluster bleep. They put them in the wrong spot. They were completely and they literally dropped them in the middle of the Viet Cong. Like it was literally dropped in the middle of the hornet's nest, and it was a disaster. And his commanders said, we can't lose a colonel. We've got to get him out. And he refused to leave. And he has this great saying that he says this to his men: "Mine will be the first boots on the battlefield, and mine will be the last boots off." That was him who said that. And Mel Gibson plays him. And
I was going to say, I have seen that now. When you said that saying.
I remember seeing this interview that Mel Gibson did. And, they asked him about it. And he said, "Well, actually, look, I've got to be honest. When he was saying, when you make a movie, it's very different to when you see it.
Yeah, true.
And he saw the movie. He was getting highly emotional. He says, I actually got up and I went to the toilet. And sure enough, Hal's there. He said, here's two guys doing what they do. And he just leaned across and said, did I do you proud? And he said, you did me so proud. And Malcolm said, I just broke into tears because this guy was so genuine as a leader. And he didn't just say the right things, he did them. And I think if you're going to be a leader, it's very, very lonely. I've been lucky enough to lead, quite large teams and also small teams, and they're both challenging. And you take on board people's challenges and problems. But at the end of the day, when you're in a commercial environment, you're there to help them pay their mortgages, but your first responsibility is typically to your shareholders to give them a return on their investment. In other words, you're juggling lots of different masters.
Well, competing priorities too, right?
Yeah, and it's that balance. And I remember one of the analogies that was given to me very early on, because I was CEO at 23, and I literally had no idea what I was doing, Sarah. And just quietly between you and I still don't.
You know what, though? There's so many people in the same position, like there's very many, very, very rarely. And I think you're probably talking about those that think they do know what they're doing. Often are those people that we talk about are bad leaders. They're managers. Because they're following a process that not necessarily includes empathy and understanding who you're working with and understanding your priorities and all of that. So I completely understand.
Yeah, I remember, again, I've been really lucky. Early on in my career, I found this great differential between what a leader is and what a manager is. And, leaders focus on vision and creation, whereas managers focus on process. And don't be wrong, you can't be a great leader without great managers.
True.
But you need to understand that they are very different things. And I'm not entirely convinced or not that you can make a leader. Like if you're instinctually a manager, that's your go-to.
Yeah.
And that's why quite often, not picking on CFOs, but quite often when CFOs become CEOs, they often fail. Unfortunately,
well, they don't have that empathy necessarily because, and it's not to their own fault. It's just that's their personality profile. They're analytical. They aren't people. It doesn't come naturally to them, but I do think you can work on it and you can definitely change. I've worked with many CFOs that have needed to step up to become the financial directors of global companies, and the key was helping them to work with their people to become and understand how to develop their people so that they could step up. So it is possible, but the innate traits are this is the process. But in saying that, I've worked with those sorts of people in sales, and they're really good at sales because they follow the process. Whereas someone that's very people orientated just goes with the flow. And
yeah, and I think that often comes down to the product or service you're selling too. Some products or service are very much process driven. Others are completely non-process driven. You've got to be highly adaptive in terms of how you're working, understand the needs of the client, provide the appropriate solutions, and quite often help them understand stuff that they might not even know they need. It's true consultative selling.
True.
But, leadership is one of those things that too, I remember, from probably when I was about 17, I always wanted to be a CEO. I always wanted to be a CEO. And
why do you think that is? What was about being a CEO was important to you?
Probably if I went back to myself at 17, it was probably about money.
Okay. It I was thinking maybe status or...
No, because I probably didn't understand it, to be honest. But I just, I remember thinking it's success.
Okay. Yeah.
A bit like that movie with Will Smith where he becomes the stock trader. And remember, he sees the guy, I'll come to this, but he sees the guy in the Ferrari turn up and he's like, what do you do?
Yeah.
And that was probably my moment of thinking CEOs, successful, the rest of it. But I remember the day I became CEO thinking, oh my God, what have I done? Like, I have no idea. Everyone's kind of looking at me. I'm this like green kind of lieutenant. The troops are kind of going, which hill are we going to take? And you just then act on your instinct and you work with your team. And there's lots of little tips and tricks. And I remember one of the great books I got given by one of my mentors was Memos to the Chairman by a guy called Al Greenberg. And Al Greenberg was the guy that built Bear Stearns. Like he literally took Bear Stearns from kind of being a nothing firm to, one of the powerhouses before they unfortunately imploded. And in this book, it's written from very much a Jewish comedic perspective, but there are his internal memos that he sent out to his team. And there's just all these little anecdotes that I still use quite a bit. Like there's one famous one where he sends a memo to all staff saying, "Hey, look, I've noticed that sick leave is going up. I just want to let everyone know, you're welcome to take sick leave, but only if you're dying." And lots of little, in a very comedic way, just kind of probably putting people on notice that, hey, it's gone a bit far. People are maybe taking advantage. And the biggest thing is that he was one of the first kind of counterintuitive thinkers where when his business was going well, he would pull back on expenses. And he was notorious for not letting anyone order paper clips or rubber bands because he's like, look, we get sent all that stuff. Why are we buying them? And I'm like, oh, I love it. Like, he was probably the first, what do they call it, circular economy thinker.
Yeah, true. Although that's not what it was referred to.
No, but what he would do is when the market had turned, it was turning into a bear market, he would then go and hire people. And the reason he hired them is because he knew it would turn back into a bull market, and he'd kind of accelerate out of those corners. And that's what I think really good leaders do, is they go with their gut. And sometimes that you can't explain that through a number or a P&L or a spreadsheet. You've just got to follow your instinct. And I think
so how do you put that in a presentation to an investor or even like staff? You need to present yourself as someone that they want to work with. So
yeah, and I think to give credit to Elon, Elon's gone broke or almost broke so many times. There's a famous story about
he's only got $4 billion instead of 44.
Yeah, but and he's the great gambler. He just bets everything on black. Now, I'm not saying that.
Do you think that's because someone told him a good CEO takes risks?
Yeah, my version of risk, which is maybe why I'm not as rich as Elon, is I'm a big believer you'd never bet the farm. You might bet part of it, but you never bet your core capital. And coming back to your point, how do you convince investors? Often that's track record. If Elon Musk said, I don't know, I'm going to go and do something crazy like go to the moon or go to Mars, people rally behind him because they're like, well, hang on, this guy's made money multiple times. But again, that's an intangible asset. That's your track record. That's your experience. It's your knowledge. It's your know-how. And again, that's why I sort of come back to, often people are lucky the first time, maybe the second time, but third time you're starting to say, hey, look, I know how this game's played.
I love it. That's awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much for Michael Masterton for sharing with us his knowledge and insights. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast. And now it's your turn to join the conversation by leaving a comment. And what have you now realized is an intangible asset that you may have not been sharing with your team or your investors? Now, if you have a topic that you would like to discuss as an influential leader or know someone, please, there's a form in our description to fill out. And if you want to improve your leadership now in your team, we've also put down a free tool for you to use. So join us and we'll see you on the next one.